Welcome back, guys. This is episode 4 of Real Talk with Bodybuilding, and we are very lucky to have Victor Black, who is an expert in all things, bodybuilding and kind of drug use. Do you want to just do a very, very short, concise reel of what you're about?
Thank you, Tom. I think it's probably fair to say that my profile is slowly growing in our tribe, in our community. So I don't have to spend as much time these days explaining my background. So I'll give you the short version. The short version is I'm a bodybuilder in my early 50s. I have been training since I was a teenager, very passionate about bodybuilding. I date back to basically the what you would call as the late tail end of the golden era, the late 80s. I started lifting, sort of thing. So quite a long time. Trained and competed as a natural for 20 years and then opened the door into enhancement. And now today, my great passion is trying to provide education and guidance to guys who are interested in enhancement, but with a viewpoint to what I would call longevity. And what I mean by that is, it's fair to say that, most professional athletes in most sports have careers of relatively limited time span. Maybe if you want to play for the Yankees or whatever, you get 5 years in the spotlight and it's all over, sort of thing. And, I tend to try to point out to guys that there's no reason in this game that you can't do what you love to do for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. But it's also fair to say that if you're going to do that as an enhanced trainer, you need to show a little bit of sophistication, a little bit of elegance, a little bit of strategic planning in the way that you approach the use of these drugs, because it's fair to say that there are very real risks involved and there are very real toxicities involved in the application of these drugs if you are heavy-handed or if you make the wrong choices of compounds. So that's my great passion today, trying to raise the awareness in our tribe about the safer application of enhancement practices with a view to practicing longevity.
Yeah, I mean, you've done a lot of great podcasts covering this. You should definitely all check them out. If you haven't seen them, go to Victor's YouTube channel and check them out. You've been on, you've had a lot of pro bodybuilders interviews you as well. But today we're not actually talking about steroids per se, the usage. We're going to delve into fat loss and the fat loss drugs and the application within a safer use model. So do you want to take that away, Victor?
Yeah, I guess I would see this as an extent. I think we've got your offsider just dialing in here. Let's see if he comes in.
Oh, perfect.
We'll give him a moment to come in and join us. We were actually the gentleman Rob is his name. Is that correct? I don't know. Yes, Rob. Yeah, Rob's going to join us. So hopefully he'll be with us in a minute. So yeah, let me just try to put some flags in the sand to try and contain the conversation, because I am one to wander off if I don't do that. So the first thing I would say is we are going to talk about anabolic steroids here, but we're also going to widen the net a little wider to broadly talk about what I would call drugs that contribute to fat loss. And that would include some pharmacological fat burning agents. Obviously, some of the tools that people use on a daily basis contribute to improvements in body composition per se, straight out the box. Okay. So make no mistake, every single dose response study ever done in these class of drugs, whether it's testosterone or one of their derivatives, whether it's the new generation of non-steroidal SARMs, whether it's the application of growth hormone, typically what we see when we talk about increases in lean tissue mass, which is what we're all chasing, at the same time we tend to see reduction in body fat. Okay. So that class of drugs in general, we would call them hypertrophic agents. That's really why we're applying them to realize a hypertrophic outcome. But along with that tends to come improvements in body composition, really by default. Yeah, really by default. As I said, every single dose response study on those class of drugs demonstrate that very, 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 very clearly. Okay, so it's fair to say that in any strategic model where we were seeking that outcome, we would have those tools on the table, but potentially we would also have some other agents. Now, let me just separate the conversation here between what I would call a cutting cycle and what I would call competition preparation, because to me, it is very, very, very important I mean, like, very important that we do that. And why? Because it's fair to say that if you're going to follow the blast cruise model, and I'll just explain for people that don't know what that means, the idea that you're going to have periods of time during a year or a time block where you would elevate the application of these drugs, right, for a growth phase, then you're going to have periods of time where you take a break to wash off stress that is induced by the use of these drugs, right? Now, does it make sense, therefore, for a recreational trainer to set up what I would call, a cutting cycle? It's the stupidest idea in the world. Why? Because you need to have a break, right? You have to have a break. I mean, most people hopefully understand that. In a year, we're going to have periods of time of exposure to these drugs. And I don't mean you necessarily stop using them totally, but ideally you're going to lower the doses down, take your foot off the gas, as it were, and give your body a chance to wash off the stress that's associated with the application of these drugs. And typically, if you think about it, when would we want to do that? When we have all of the cards on the table that are going to create a growth phase for us. So we have caloric intake, we have training volume, we have growth promoters. Or do you do it when you are least likely going to grow tissue? In other words, in a caloric deficit. So hopefully just anyone that's been training long enough realizes that the most powerful anabolic tool that we have in our toolbox is food, okay? It's very, very difficult for people with any sort of training age to realize an increase in lean tissue mass unless they have a very good nutritional model in place. And typically you need to be in at least a small caloric deficit. I would argue, a very large caloric deficit, but at least a small one. I think everybody would agree with that. And you're far less likely to grow tissue when you're in a caloric restricted environment. In other words, you're dieting. So if you just think about it logically, when would we apply the growth promoters? In growth phase or in a fat loss wash-off phase? Hopefully, logically and rationally, everyone will say, well, it makes sense to take a break when we're not going to be growing tissue. Why? Because at the end of the day, washing off body fat is a relatively simple thing to do. It's not terribly complicated. Your mum could do it. Whereas growing tissue is a very hard thing to do. Once you get past the bounds of what is considered to be natural levels of tissue growth, it's hard to put on 20 pounds of muscle tissue. It's very fucking easy to wash off 20 pounds of fat. Okay. So just the idea of a cutting cycle for recreational trainers makes no sense, because here's the thing. So when are you going to take a break? During growth phase? In other words, let's say we had a 12 block cycle in front of us. It's now 1st of March and we're looking out for the next 12 months. Obviously, there will be growth phases in there. There'll be maintenance phases, and there'll be, fat loss washout phases. When is the most logical time for us to apply these growth promoters? Well, during fucking growth phase. And when is the most logical time to take a break? Well, when we're washing off the fat. Now, that doesn't mean, as I said, that you would completely remove all of the tools from the table, but you wouldn't have the volume turned up, if that makes sense. You would be doing it in a moderate way. The obvious exception that breaks that rules is for a competitor. Now, for a competitor, the absolute opposite is probably true, where you're probably going to expose yourself to the greatest volume of drugs and potentially even the most toxic of drugs right before competition. And this applies for powerlifters and strength athletes and bodybuilders alike. Okay. So it's important when you have this conversation that you understand, so am I a recreational trainer that doesn't compete, or am I a competition athlete? And based on that decision, how you structure a strategic model will be very, 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 very different. As I said, competitive bodybuilder, enhanced, going into a show in the 60 to 90 days leading into that band, that's probably going to be your period of highest stress when you're dieting, right? And I mean stress from the drugs, right? But anyone who's a recreational trainer that wanted to have the highest level of stress when they're washing up, that makes no sense. That's just ultimately going to hold back your growth. Okay.
So I'm assuming in the recreational user, you're not going to want to use as many different options as for fat loss as you would if you're doing a competition, right? Or not?
I don't know that I would necessarily agree with that. I do accept that many of my models are controversial, but I'll give you an example. What I mean by that is in recreational, athletes, okay, it's fair to say that anabolic steroids, testosterone and its derivatives, are massively overused. Okay. Mm-hmm. And typically what recreational lifters are doing is they're choosing to modulate one of the 8 or 9 potential pathways that we could modulate for a performance outcome, literally the application of a ligand to the androgen receptor. That's pretty much all they do. And they will stack multiple anabolic steroids on top of themselves at sometimes eye-watering doses to get that. Now, one could easily argue that opening up the list of drugs so that you have a longer list of drugs allows you, if you're intelligent, to basically lower the amount of anabolic steroids you might need for potentially either a similar or even better outcome with lower cumulative stress. So I'll give you an example. If someone said to me, we're talking about growth phase right now here, we'll talk about fat loss in a minute. If someone said to me, describe the safest possible cycle, I would make the argument that a small amount of anabolic steroids and a small amount of a growth hormone product and a small amount of insulin would be preferential to saying, well, I'm not going to use growth hormone, I'm not going to use insulin, I'm just going to use a gigantic whack of steroids. Right? So that's in my opinion. Anyone that understands this, I think, can understand the validity of that discussion. You're using a smaller amount of multiple pathways that are all synergistic to each other. And it's not to say that they don't contain stress, but very often the dose is the poison. So that more of a compound you use, the greater the stress that you create. And by opening up the discussion and potentially putting multiple metabolic pathways on the table, you have the potential to get, as I said, equal or even better outcomes with a larger number of drugs at very near clinical doses sometimes. Yeah. So that's, so I always like to talk about the good, the bad, the ugly. I always say to someone, if people are not prepared to disclose to you the challenges of a particular methodology or model, then maybe you should be careful listening. Let me be very blunt about what the challenges are. So that would mean more to learn, more moving parts, and very plausibly, it would cost more money to follow that model, right? Testosterone, nandrolone, these types of drugs are dirt cheap and not terribly difficult to administer at an agricultural basis. Once you start introducing peptide hormones and you start introducing, some other, metabolic modulators and things like that, it's more moving parts. It costs more money. That's just the truth of the matter. Okay. Mm. So yeah, we could talk about the model, but I think whenever we talk about drugs that contribute to fat loss, you have to start the conversation with our understanding. There is a model that makes sense for recreational trainers, serious recreation. I don't think you should be using the drugs if you're not a serious trainer, right? But there's a model that makes sense for the serious recreational trainer. He's not going to be as focused on fat loss pharmacology because he doesn't need to get into the single-digit body fat. Most recreational trainers, let's say you peak your growth phase at, let's just be really modest. He's 15 to 18%. That's hardly over fat, right? He doesn't need to get down to 5% to restart a growth phase. He just needs to wash it off, probably down to what I call beach worthy, maybe 9-10%. You're in. So the need to leverage these drugs becomes less critical for a recreational trainer. He's undulating his body fat percentage between, say, 10% and 18%, maybe, whereas a competitive bodybuilder is going from 18% down to single-digit figures. And the application of a lot of these pharmacological agents really becomes more insightful, more, strategic, once you get to those single digits. Getting down to 10% body fat, I'm just fucking honest, it's not that hard to do. You need to basically move more and eat less and understand that the drugs that you're currently using are already contributing to anti-catabolic action and already contributing to improved body composition. So really, the conversation needs to kind of take two parts. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't use some of these tools. Okay.
So it doesn't. Why don't we go into what a recreational user would do then, and then go from there?
Okay, cool. So I just want to show you a little slide that sometimes I find it really easy for us to, look at things graphics and images. I'm a very visual person. So I just created this slide that shows us a number of different classes of what we would call, drugs, if you wish, right? Compounds, we'll call them, that plausibly contribute to fat loss in our tribe, in our community. All right. So let me just quickly go around this. So, of course, anabolic steroids. I would also accept the fact that if people are talking about both steroidal SARMs, which are primobolan, nandrolone, masteron, etc., Anavar, you would also include non-steroidal SARMs in that class. You would expect to see an increase in lean tissue mass and a reduction in body fat. Every single dose response study that we have on those drugs demonstrates that. Growth hormone, thyroid hormones, catalyst, for example, injectable L-carnitine, which we'll talk about, PPR mediators, we would broadly call these metabolic modulators. Yeah, glucose disposal agents. There are drugs like Gohimbine, drugs like Clenbuterol. There are lipase inhibitors like orlistat, which is probably not well known in our tribe. This is more a drug for treatment of clinical obesity. Some people in our tribe use it. I'm not a big fan of it. And then, of course, the dirty secret that basically sits in the background called chemical uncouples, which is DMP and BAM15 and these types of drugs. And I'm more than happy. I'm not a fan of those drugs, but I'm very happy to talk about them because I think it's important to educate people about the good, the bad, the ugly of what happens in our community, not just to stick your head in the sand and ignore the 800-pound gorilla. So let's just talk about, let's say you were a serious recreational trainer and you undertook a growth phase. Anyone that's watched my content in the past would know that I'm a fan of low and slow and steady. So in other words, we want a long period of relentless progress towards our goals. And typically, I think it's fair to say that, a lot of guys would be underpinning that with, testosterone and potentially, either one or two more anabolic steroids, probably something from the DHT class and maybe even something from the 19-nor derivatives class. Those drugs, as I said, are anti-catabolic in nature, and they're also contributing to fat loss, just straight off the cuff as they stand, okay? You might also find people are using, growth hormone. Growth hormone is probably a better fat loss tool than it is a hypertrophic agent. It certainly contributes to hypertrophic outcomes, but it's in terms of bang for its buck, you probably get a greater return for fat loss than you do for anything from growth hormone. So most guys would be familiar with those two drugs and probably deploying them in growth phases. So if we just and I'll throw one other one in there, the PPR mediator. Anyone that's heard me talk about ARBs, I'm a very big fan of the drug telmisartan. This is a drug that, in my opinion, you should be using an ARB or an angiotensin receptor blocker by default if you use anabolic steroids for the suppression of angiotensin 2. That drug is also a metabolic modulator, so it's contributing to our visceral fat level, percentages and things like that. So let's just say we have those three drugs on the table: some anabolic steroids, some growth hormones. Now, the average recreational trainer, in my opinion, during a fat loss phase would potentially lower down the exposure of those compounds, not completely remove them necessarily, but lower them down, understanding that without the calories in place to support growth, right, we're far less likely to get maximum tissue growth in that point in time. We have to have a break. So let's have a break when we're washing off the fat. We'll keep enough of them in there so they contribute. And the lion's share then of the caloric, imbalance that causes consequential fat loss. Obviously, people understand that you have at a rudimentary level, you have calories in equals calories out. And basically, if you're consuming, more calories than you consume during the day, ultimately you're going to end up storing whatever you're not using as adipose tissue as body fat. And inversely, if you are expending more energy than you are consuming, your body needs to mobilize and oxidize that fat as a fuel source, okay? So for that recreational trainer, you would potentially just keep their anabolic steroids and the growth hormone in place, but you would lower them down so that they're not potentially causing stress and allowing any stress that you have incurred during the growth phase to basically wash off. Is there anything that I would say, yes, I think you could put that on the table as well. Yeah, I think that a little bit of clenbuterol makes perfect sense in that situation. Clenbuterol is both a fat loss agent and a hypertrophic agent in its own right. It does have very good anti-catabolic properties, and a very small amount of clenbuterol goes a very long way. And something like Gohimbine. Gohimbine is a drug that people either tolerate it very well and they like using it, or they tend not to do it. Typically, people who suffer from anxiety and from already elevated blood pressure don't do well on Gohimbine. But if you like Gohimbine, then again, a small amount of Gohimbine at say 0.2 milligrams per kilogram, which would be for a 100 kilogram man about 20 milligrams a day. So in other words, we're bringing in 2 additional agents, but lowering down the growth promotion agents in that model. I think that's a very practical model. I don't think that recreational lifters need DNP and other chemical uncouplers, during a diet phase. You just don't need to do that. And I am happy to talk about how DNP works in that, but quite honestly, most people that are using DNP are doing so they don't have to have nutritional control. You literally hear them speak. You don't have to go to the gym. You stand on the couch and put the fan on you and do nothing, and the fat comes off. That's it's so opposed to my philosophy of why we're doing this. I enjoy the training. I enjoy the journey. I enjoy the nutritional modeling. Have I experimented with DNP? Yes. I don't think you can talk critically about a product unless you've exposed yourself to it. So I understand the drug. I understand how it works. I've read plenty on it. It's not even that I don't support it. If you were a 400-pound clinically obese male, could you make an argument for the application of a chemical uncoupler under medical supervision because you just need to go from 400 pounds to a healthy weight? Yeah, I'm happy to talk to people, about how they would apply it with their doctor's supervision. Now, find a doctor that will support you is a different conversation there. But for a healthy young man with good nutritional control, I'm not sure what they're trying to do except be fucking lazy, quite bluntly. So I'm not sure. Go ahead. Sorry.
I was about to say, moving backwards real quick. What in your ideas is in the realm of a safe use dosage of clenbuterol? Because I know a lot of people, they go a bit crazy with the clen, and I know people that even do 200 mcg of it. So
yeah, so it's one of clenbuterol is a drug that I think is massively maligned by our community because it's not well understood. So there's lots and lots and lots of medical clinical applications for clenbuterol, and the drug is very well tolerated in human beings up to about 120 micrograms a day, right? Mm-hmm. But I would like to stay back from that threshold. Probably I would say to people, look, if you've not used clenbuterol before, you should probably come out the gate at 40 micrograms a day and feel free to titrate to 80 micrograms a day. We actually, in 2019, saw a really nice study in healthy young men using 80 micrograms of clenbuterol a day, and we saw the consequence of that action. And believe me, it's not insignificant. You're going to get a really good bang for your buck out of 80 micrograms, both from observation, right, and from clinical evidence. And said that really, really, really lovely study for our community done in 2019 that looked effectively, what is the consequence of applying 80 micrograms a day to healthy young men in terms of fat oxidation levels? More than enough. Yeah. Now,
so sorry, real quick again. I was about to say, I mean, in your opinion, what about the cycling of it? I mean, some people use ketofen in order to extend the longevity
That's
of it.
Complete bro
your
science.
Thoughts on this? Okay, bro science. There we go.
Bro science. I'll just explain it. Is it true that clenbuterol, and this applies to all beta-2 androgenic agonists, by the way, it's not just clenbuterol, that the prolonged application of these drugs causes a downregulation of the receptor? Absolutely 100% true in skeletal muscle tissue. That's not what we're doing with clenbuterol. We're using it in a fat loss role. So does its hypertrophic potential, and you have to understand clenbuterol is a potential growth promoter, does its hypertrophic potential become significantly impacted by the downregulation of the receptor at skeletal muscle tissue level? You bet your ass it does, like significantly so. That's not what we're trying to do here. This is a fat loss discussion, right? And that downregulation is in skeletal muscle tissue. So again, people half understand things and then half have an opinion on things. So I'll give you a simple example. If we were to be using clenbuterol as a hypertrophic agent, number one, not a particularly effective tool for men. Women are so exquisitely sensitive to growth promoters in general that you could give a woman 40 micrograms of clenbuterol and you'll actually see an improvement in actual body composition, not just fat, right? But you won't see that in men by itself. You might be able to measure certain cascades and certain pathways that said, look, in theory, yes, but like in the real world, like anyone that says that clenbuterol is a substitute for anabolic steroids or even SARMs, it's not that powerful, right? Yes, in women. You just have to understand a woman needs 3 milligrams of testosterone a week to be bouncing against her natural limits. In that organism, a little bit of clenbuterol produces that outcome. So if you are using it as a hypertrophic agent in women, that's a very valid discussion because the receptors in skeletal muscle tissue definitely downregulate. But that's not what people 99% of the time are trying to do with clenbuterol. They're trying to use it. But I think you'd agree with me. Most people would call clenbuterol a fat loss agent.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So in that context, it's just fucking bro science. It's like, yeah, but that's in the skeletal muscle tissue. Do you follow the point? Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
So you can, for fat loss, you can just run it as is 6 weeks, 8 weeks, whatever.
It doesn't stop working.
Oh wow. Okay, just blowing my mind right there.
just so I'm clear, so nobody goes blah, blah, blah. Yes, 100% true that in skeletal muscle tissue, the chronic application of clenbuterol over a multi-day time frame will ultimately result in the downregulation of the receptor in skeletal muscle tissue. That is not what we are doing. Cool.
Okay. Thank you. That's good.
Okay, so I would argue that for a recreational user, some anabolic steroids, some growth hormone, a metabolic modulator like telmisartan, maybe even a glucose disposal agent like berberine or metformin, maybe, some Gohimbine and some clenbuterol. That's a pretty good list of shit on the table. Like, let's face facts, that's not, slim pickings, as it were. Yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm. But my focus would be, I know I sound like a broken record at time, is we want to use amounts of these drugs that allow us the outcome we seek without adding stress to our period of time where we're trying to wash off stress. And I fully support the idea that it's very plausible that 40 micrograms or even 80 micrograms of clenbuterol will significantly contribute to our fat loss goals here without really bringing too much stress to the table. And this is where you said, I've heard about guys using such and such a dose. I go, yeah, but you understand that that's breaking that model. Like they're inducing tremendous amount of stress in the period of time that we're supposed to be washing off stress. Mm-hmm. Okay. So then what we'll just flip this and go, okay, so then what would a competition cycle look like, right? And I think it's fair to say that it's not terribly dissimilar. We're really still going to be drawing compounds from these various classes of compounds, but the very nature of competition is that we're going to be exposing ourselves to probably the greatest dosages of these drugs for the whole year in the weeks and months leading up to the event. Ideally, you want to start low and titrate the dose on a needs basis as you get closer and closer and closer to the show. As you pass the 10% threshold, it is fair to say that it becomes increasingly difficult to mobilize that stubborn fat. Yeah. And these tools play a greater and greater role. And quite bluntly, you start turning the dosages up. But you have to understand that action has a consequence. You start toning the doses up, you start causing stress. So it's plausible that a competitor gets to the end of competition and has acquired such stress that he needs a break following the show. You see the disconnect, you're starting to see the disconnect between why would a recreational trainer want to undertake drug use that at the end of the fat loss phase, he needs to take a break because that's when you want to start fucking growing. Do you know what I mean? Whereas a competitor, most competitors would appreciate the fact that, you know what, it's not an unreasonable conversation to have to say, look, if I was to compete in October of this year, it's very likely that in, October, so, the September, October timeframe, my body is probably going to get a fucking hammering during that time. And I maybe need to take a little bit of time after that to take a bit of a break. And this is the paradox, of course. Usually when we compete, we set ourselves up, prime ourselves for a nice push out the gate, a nice growth phase, but it's not necessarily the best time for us to do that because we're carrying cumulative stress that has been, acquired during the preparation process.
Yeah.
So not terribly difficult, different drugs. I've met very, very few competitive bodybuilders that use, chemical uncouplers like DMP. They certainly do get used, but quite bluntly, they're usually used by people who are behind the eight ball. They know that they're well behind the game and they're desperately trying to catch up, and they realize it's not the ideal solution, but they kind of force their hand. So I'm very empathetic to professional athletes that sometimes have to do things that we don't ideally want to do because that's how they make bank. So I'm interested in your idea of when you deploy these strategies, because I'm assuming you don't want to start out the gate with all these, an amalgamation of all these drugs. I mean, obviously anabolics and growth hormone will be in from the start, but then when would you start implementing the thyroid hormones and all of these others? Yeah. So that's a very good point. I guess what I would say is my opinion about contest preparation, we'll just kind of focus on contest preparation now. Yeah. Okay. My opinion about contest preparation, quite honestly, has been formed from my experience as a natural athlete. Okay. Most elite naturals don't compete every year. And the reason they don't compete every year is the process of getting yourself to that level of body composition naturally takes a huge toll on the human body. So by the time they recover from putting themselves through that process, your hormonal profile just basically goes into the toilet when you do that naturally. Yeah. So you could actually make an argument that said, okay, so you know what, if you actually decided to get really lean and you just used a little bit of all these drugs, that would be plausibly healthier for you than trying to do it naturally. As a natural athlete, by the time you get to that level of body composition, your testosterone production's in the toilet, your growth hormone production's in the toilet, your cortisol levels are through the roof. You're in like everything on an endocrinological basis is basically screwed, right? Now, if you said, right, what if I took, let's just say, a testosterone replacement therapy dose of testosterone, would that serve me well? Would that plausibly give me a better, healthier pathway than, trying to do this naturally? You bet your ass. But it's an unfair advantage, and that's why they don't let TRT into natural bodybuilding. Okay. Yeah. So I would argue that a little bit of these compounds strategically deployed is probably far healthier in the natural bodybuilding, but I mean a little bit. And what I mean by that is, so an extended caloric deficit, ultimately we know metabolic adaptation occurs. One of the mechanisms that your body does that through is the modulation of thyroid hormones. Okay. So when we deployed thyroid hormones, would we be deploying them as an agent ever of themselves, or would we just trying to replace the dose of thyroid hormone to natural levels as we see a decline in thyroid hormones as we have an extended calorie deficit? I see you nodding. So you understand where I'm going with this, right? Yeah. So the dose matters. Yeah. So if you took 1 to 2 units of growth hormone, 160, 180 milligrams of testosterone, a little bit of thyroid, a little bit T3, a little bit T4. All we're doing is replacing these hormonal profiles. And realistically, you can do that from day one because there's no stress involved. And you can have this just nice, easy kind of walk into thing. A little bit of Clenbuterol, a little bit of test, a little bit. Now that's not going to support the tissue for a professional bodybuilder. I'm just talking about someone who's a low, I don't want to say low level, a drug using recreational trainer. Yeah. Okay. If you follow that model, in my opinion, that's a year-round model. You can live in that place forever because you're in 160 milligrams of testosterone. That's TRT. There's millions of men that demonstrate the efficacy and safety of that over a lifetime. Why couldn't you do it? It's a permanent discussion. Like, I'm just going to put that in, I'm going to leave that alone, and that's going to make my life a hell of a lot easier. I know that T3, I know that T4 is going to be negatively impacted by extended caloric deficit. So I will take enough of those drugs not to leverage a performance benefit, but just to replace dose. Okay.
Yeah.
That is a very static discussion. I would argue you do that year round. Now, if you're going to turn the heat up, if you're going to blast, like they like to say, right, and you're going to blast into a competition, you really want to set it up so that if you do a competition preparation, and this is what I said about naturals, lots and lots and lots of naturals these days are taking 30 weeks to get ready for a show. That's how they get to the body composition levels they get to. I mean, it's the time frame is growing and growing and growing and growing. Yeah, a lot of these guys, a year to grow, a year to compete. So they have they compete every second year, and they'll have a 30-year preparation process. Now, most enhanced trainers, especially from the era that I grew up in, we used to do 12-week, preps, right?
Yeah.
And then it became 16, and then it became 20. It's growing. People are getting longer and longer. So I would argue if you're going to do a 12-week prep, then some degree of titration of dosages over time makes sense, but it's less of a discussion than if you have a longer preparation process. Let's just say we're going to have a 24-week prep. Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
So what that would mean is that you want to put the minimum clinical effective dose of these drugs on the table, and you want to keep some cards up your sleeve so you deploy them on a needs basis. The goal being relentless progress towards our goal, the minimum amount of stress, but the maximum physical, like the best return that we can get, right? So what that's basically saying is, if we could hold some of these drugs off until, later in the game, right, then we should do that. Which are the drugs that we would hold off? One, we would hold the dose off, potentially, and also potentially we would hold the more, the harsher drugs, the drugs that are tougher on our body, for that time frame. So I'll give you a simple example of that. If you looked at something like growth hormone, if you're using it just as a fat loss agent, there is a theoretical limit to how much growth hormone you can take in a single administration to get, like a mobilization of stored body fat. And that's about 1.5 units. Okay. Yeah. Taking more than that doesn't do anything in a fat loss model. There's like a throttle, there's a natural bottleneck. So you would basically say, okay, so I'm going to take 1.5 units, and you might start off by just doing that once a day, but as you got closer and closer and closer to the show, you may end up with multiple administrations later in the day. You wouldn't necessarily raise the dose at that point, but you would start introducing multiple points of administration. Obviously, esteroids, anabolic steroids, you don't need to do that, but there are some drugs that have a relatively short life of action, like recombinant human growth hormone, that you could, like injectable L-carnitine and those types of concepts. So I would argue that if we took a 24-week window to get ready for a show, and obviously, do you need 24 weeks? No, but I would argue that slow and steady is better than brutalize yourself. And 24 weeks probably allows enough time to have a diet break in there. So you can kind of get down to 10% and then basically hang out there maybe at maintenance calories for a couple of weeks, take a break, wash off the fatigue you acquire in a diet process, and then push on again. Rather than a 12-week process, which really just becomes, you put your foot on the gas and you you just blast your way down to where you get. And I'm sure it doesn't take much to appreciate that, if you go slow and steady, generally in most things, this serves us well for our longevity, discussion. Don't get too fat in the off season, but you need to eat. So you need to put on some weight. So if you get to where I get to, I like to get to about 30 to 40 pounds off stage weight myself. Yeah. That's not something I want to wash off in 12 weeks, but I'm very comfortable doing it in double that time frame. It's a relatively easy walk in. Now, it's important for me to say at this point in time, the lion's share of the work is done here is through caloric restriction. Okay. The drugs contribute, the cardio contributes, but the lion's share is done through caloric restriction. In my opinion, the first thing you do is you address the caloric restriction, you set yourself up with an appropriate level of caloric restriction, and you watch what happens. and then basically start to walk in the tools that we have to accelerate that process on a needs basis. In other words, you don't need to start doing 2 hours cardio on week one, and you don't need to reduce 1,000 calories in your diet on week one. That just doesn't make any sense. No one does that, right? So why the fuck would you start with all of your drugs on week one?
Yeah.
You know, if someone said to me, look, I'm going to prepare, I'm going to do a 20 or 24 week prep, and I'm going to be doing the same amount of cardio on day one as I'm going to be doing like in the 2 weeks before the show. And I'm going to be having the same amount of calories, and I'm going to be using the same drugs. I go, you fucking have no idea what you're doing. You're a fucking moron, Julian. And yet that's how guys approach this, Julian.
Yeah.
You start off slow. Maybe you do 30 minutes cardio 3 times a week, Julian. Maybe you lower your calories down a bit, but you have to understand that you're going to have multiple adjustments to caloric intake. You're going to have multiple reviews of structured cardio. Is that enough? You may need to turn the volume up. And you're going to have multiple reviews of, like turning the tools that we can use for fat loss. For some stupid reason, I have no idea. I've never met anybody that says, yeah, you come out the gate with 2 hours cardio, come out the gate with misery calories. You know what it's like getting ready for a show? Misery, right? Yeah. I've never met anybody that says that, right? But the fucking idiots come out the gate with all the drugs on day one. It's like, what the fuck are you doing? You just have no idea what you're doing, right? So slowly, you want to hold back the drugs so that you're getting the response that you're seeking, right, without laying anything down on the table unnecessarily. In other words, if 40 micrograms of clenbuterol does the job, why are you going to 80? I'm not opposed to going to 80, but my only question is why? Why are you doing that? Just because is not an appropriate response, right?
So like on a recreational user model, and then just really ramp everything up.
It's the same model. You start off relatively moderate during, and as you move forward. Now, some individuals are going to respond. The degree of inter-individual genetic response to all drugs is truly profound, right? Some people have fucking day jobs that they burn a lot of calories. They're laborers and they work on building sites. I sit on my ass all day talking to people on Zoom. During I apart from walking my dogs and apart from going to the gym, I don't expend energy. During. So everybody's going to be different, but the premise here is that you would look at the class of drugs and ideally look at that framework. And we said, look, in the real world, what you do is like maybe take a little from each of those classes. I would much rather someone have a longer list of pharmaceutical contributors here, right, than to say, I'm going to use 200 micrograms of clenbuterol. Well, why can't you just use a little bit of this and a little bit of that, which, harks back to my growth model as well. It's the same fucking discussion.
Yeah.
A little bit of this and a little bit of that. Why? Because they all contribute something and they all work on different metabolic pathways. And we all know that at a certain point, toxicity presents, right? None of these drugs are take as much as you want without consequence. None of them. So it just makes sense if you're faced with two models. It says model one says, right, I'm just going to take 2 or 3 of those drugs and use a fuck ton of them, right? Or I might take 20 of those fucking things and use a little bit of it. And I say 20, I'm not joking when I say, and I'm talking about including anabolic steroids, a little bit of testosterone, a little bit of mastron, a little bit of proviron, a little bit of trembolone. Hell, we're up to 4 already. 20 is not ridiculous. You know what I'm saying? Like by the time you get to, there may well be 20 different drugs on the table. Injectable L-carnitine, a little bit of insulin, you go down the list sort of thing. I would much prefer to support that model than the overuse of, 3 drugs. I use testosterone, trembolone, and clenbuterol to get ready for show. I'm not saying it doesn't work, and that's the most important takeaway from all of these discussions. A fool would argue it doesn't work. I would argue that you could potentially get equal or better outcomes to that model in a more sustainable practice, right, that you'll be able to do for many, many years, right, than the overuse of a handful of simple compounds during and then realizing toxicity consequential to the overuse of individual drugs. 200 milligrams of clenbuterol a day, there's a consequence to that. In my opinion, it's not healthy. And I would even say, the overuse of stimulants in general is something that I don't recommend and don't support. I'm not a fan of using stimulants. Stimulants and combined with anabolic steroids is to me a recipe for cardiovascular issues. Right? Yeah. There's actually, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, go for it. Yeah,
no, I was just going to say there's actually a little bit of evidence now. We're starting to see, some issues with the use of stimulants and the use of anabolic steroids and the consequences to people's health, combining that combination. And I mean by stimulants, like the pharmaceutical type stimulants that most people are aware of, sort of thing that I just don't think you need. Yeah.
I don't want to take too much of your time left,
yep.
but can we quickly talk about L-carnitine and just your implementation and what your thoughts are on that, because that's something that isn't really covered too much.
Yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't necessarily agree with that. I think that there's a tremendous amount of information about L-carnitine on the web.
It's gotten a lot of popularity now.
Yeah, but what I mean is, like, if you ignore the discussion about oral versus injectable, there's a lot of information about. I mean, every fucking supplement store in the world has it on the shelf, right? Yeah. And you pick it up and read the bottle, and you read the list of things it does, right? So it's not a new compound, it's not a surprise, and most people have heard of it. What they don't realize is the bioavailability of it is dog shit in oral form.
Yeah.
Right. And all of the wonderful benefits that you'll hear demonstrated in the evidence are all on either transdermal or intravenous administration. That's not oral application, those studies that are being used to promote L-carnitine. So L-carnitine is everything that says it is, but you have to understand those studies are done on either transdermal or injectable versions, right?
Yeah.
So the reason I push back on that a little bit is I think everybody's heard of L-carnitine, and they heard of here's the list of shit it does, and I go, yeah, that's like you're right, but you can't stick it in your fucking mouth, right? You have to, if you're going to use it, you have to inject it. And not intravenously. We don't inject drugs intravenously in our tribe. We inject them subcutaneously or intramuscularly. Many of the studies have even been done on intravenous studies, so we have to account for that to some degree. Just to give you, there are a lot of drugs that fall into this class. There's a drug called SR9009. It's sold in the SARM circles. Again, people don't understand is the injectable bioavailability of that is, for all intents purposes, 100%. Let's say 97%. All right. The bioavailability of that drug orally is 2.2%. It's dog shit, right? Wow. So all of the studies on that drug that show the outcomes as they are on injectable versions, and this is exactly the same thing with L-carnitine. That list of things that you read is absolutely true, but the context matters. It's injected or it's transdermally applied. Okay, so yeah, I'm a huge fan of the drug. I think it's got a
lot of synergy with a lot of people have been doing it with insulin. Can you explain the science behind?
Yeah, I don't know that you necessarily.
Or you're not agreeing with that?
No, I do. What I'm saying is you can potentially do it with you. You understand your own body has the capacity to produce insulin.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, and what a lot of people don't understand is naturally produced insulin is more rapidly acting than even rapid acting insulin. So provided you're taking L-carnitine with food, right, then you probably have that covered.
Right.
Where people are using injectable L-carnitine with the injectable insulin, and I'm certainly a fan of it, right, is in what you would call either a fasted or semi-fasted state, right? So L-carnitine, in my opinion, is most effective. I mean, there are many things that you could say it does. People want to argue about, like, it upregulates androgen receptors, all these things. It's not that it's not true. It's just in the context thing, well, hang on, androgens uprate androgen receptors. They don't downregulate them, they upregulate them. So if you're taking androgens and you're doing this and you're doing that, there's all these things that upregulate, like androgens, the androgen receptors, sorry. The question is to what, clinical effect, right? We don't have down-regulated androgen receptors as androgen users. We have up-regulated receptors. So although I agree that that context of the use of injectable carnitine as an androgen receptor upregulator is in the context of down-regulated androgens, which means you're not using androgens. Does that make sense? Yeah. So it's technically true, but we're using androgens. So that thing that it doesn't apply to us. More practically, it applies to a natural. But then like you have to question: are you natural if you're injecting fucking? That's not my definition of natural. Like someone sitting there fucking doing intramuscular injections of fucking amino acids is not a quote natural bodybuilder. So look, I would argue the primary benefit of L-carnitine in a fat loss scenario. So we're not talking about hypertrophic model here. Most compounds that we use, you can have an interesting discussion about. So what does it do in the context of fat loss? What does it do in the context of hypertrophy? This is true for all of these drugs. Okay, Clenbuterol, testosterone, steroids, growth hormone, insulin, In the context of L-carnitine, what does it do in terms of fat loss? Fundamentally, it's a transportation tool that helps to mobilize the released fatty acids into the mitochondria as an energy source. So we're using a drug like recombinant human growth hormone to effectively liberate free fatty acids from fat storage cells, right? And then the L-carnitine is placed at that time, but ideally you want to do that in a fast state, right? So we would use like 1 unit of Humalog, and we wouldn't have food there, and so we're basically getting the insulin without the glucose levels in the food, in the bloodstream rather. Okay, so a very technically correct way to do things, and I certainly do it. But and again, if you're not an experienced insulin user, I would suggest that you engage a experienced enhancement coach to help you with that strategy. So, but as a general rule of thumb, the amount of insulin that you need to see that response from L-carnitine is a very small amount. It's not a super physiological dose. In terms of, so how much? What does that look like in the real world? You're talking about 1 unit of insulin. That's a very small amount of insulin. And the only reason we place that there is because we are effectively fasted, but we want the insulin response. And you don't get the insulin response until you introduce the food. So a little bit technical. And again, if people are interested in that, my guidance is simply hire someone that knows what they're talking about to sit down with you and create a holistic strategic model that is going to allow you to get the most out of all of these compounds, because there is absolutely a discussion about some of these drugs need to be timed, some of them don't. Any esterized hormone really doesn't need to be timed. In other words, it doesn't make whether you take it 3 o'clock in the morning or 3 p.m. at night. It's an esterized hormone. And some of these drugs, like L-carnitine and insulin and growth hormone and such, when you take them, can provide a significant margin of difference of outcome. Cool.
So I was about to say, so final thing, because I don't want to keep you too long. Upper limits of kind of thyroid dosages. I mean, T3, T4, because there's a lot of, I feel, abuse in shows with that. So be interesting to see what your point would be on that.
So again, I always point to the idea that there is a massive degree of intra-individual genetic response to all drugs, right? So, is it fair to say that, what I would say is an appropriate dose of testosterone that, let's just argumentatively say I started a new client out on 250 milligrams of testosterone, and then we titrated to 300. There are some guys out there, that's enough that you're going to start to see a response. And there are some guys out there, they just need more. They have a certain genetic profile. We know now why that is. Okay. That, it's not really a case of more for that individual, if you understand, because he has a certain response to that same amount. Okay. So what I mean by that is you can give a 100 milligram administration of testosterone to an individual, and that will produce a certain amount of serum level testosterone and consequently a certain physiological response, right? And the next guy needs twice the amount, right? And the same is true of thyroid hormone, but the only way that you ascertain that is you start at what is the clinical minimal effective dose, and you titrate for effect. Do you know?
Yeah.
So I think it's fair to say that very few people do that. They just ask the question rather, what's the most I can take, and they start there.
Yeah.
So I don't recommend that model for any drug, but I do agree with you. But I would argue that the overuse of these drugs is across the board. People use more growth hormone than they need. People use more insulin than they need. People use more fucking trenbolone than they need. People use more clenbuterol. Like it's not fair to say like thyroid stands out as the one example. It's just across the board. You use too much of fucking everything. Doing, but ironically, if you actually coach enough people and you see what they've done in the past, usually they are kind of like using a small number of drugs and abusing them. And I'm kind of saying, you know what, like in theory, you could probably use more drugs, like the list. The list is longer, but we're more at clinical dose. I like to use the analogy for people that like analogies of building a race car. If you build a race car, everything matters. The steering matters, the suspension matters, the wheels and tire package matters. Yes, the power output for the engine matters. Everything matters. And so you go to work on everything, and you take the stock and make it not stock anymore. So there isn't like a model that says, okay, so we're going to build a race car, and all we're going to do here, right, is we're going to fucking, put a bigger engine in the thing, and we're going to basically, put some tires on the back and leave everything on stock. Like that's a stupid model to build a race car. And the intelligent model is say, okay, so what is our budget? What is the class? What are the rules? How do we build a race car to get the most bang for our buck? And 9 times out of 10, probably 99 times out of 100, truth be told, it would be the moderate modulation of every system on the car within the budget that you've got, right, is probably going to produce the most reliable, highest performing car rather than overspending in one area. Yeah. And as I said, I think that's an appropriate analogy because everybody has a budget, everybody has class rules, everybody has this, these things you can't modify and these things you can, So I think you just need to look at it and kind of say, okay, so just as a general strategy, we're probably better off trying to come up with a strategy that says, let's spend a little money on all of the things that matter rather than becoming obsessively focused on horsepower or obsessively focused on the fucking sound system. That's it. But you know what I'm saying? Like this is how kids build cars. They've got a piece of shit $500 car and they've got a fucking $5,000 stereo.
Big spoiler on the back.
Yeah. It's just it's not a race car. That's stupid. So I hopefully people can connect with that analogy. So yeah, it's a now obviously this conversation is a relatively high level first pass. Then what comes from that is, what I would call going further and down the rabbit hole, talking about, so exactly how do these compounds work, by what mechanism of action? Let's talk about the good, the bad, the ugly, because it is fair to say that all of these drugs have good, bad, and ugly. And I think that you have a responsibility as an enhanced athlete to either understand what those things are or engage, as I said, a professional enhancement coach that can, basically be in your corner to help you make those strategic decisions for you. Don't be fooled by me saying like new classes of drugs, doesn't come with any consequence. That's irresponsible. And that's, hopefully people understand that is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is I believe that the model of lowering the dosages of the overused drugs and potentially bringing up some of the things you might not have considered, to be in your class before, would make sense. And as I said, I think that's best represented by the recreational lifter, who's the guy who's just using anabolic steroids at the moment and experiencing toxicity outcomes from that. I would be encouraging him to lower the doses of the anabolic steroids and say, look, what else is out there that we might potentially be able to bring to the table, regardless of whether it's growth phase or fat loss phase, so we can get the best outcomes we can get with the least amount of stress, so that we can enjoy our chosen hobby and our chosen sport for the greatest possible number of years.
I think definitely agree with you. I mean, very insightful. The fact that, you know, just using a little bit of, like your other model, use a little bit of everything. And
pretty much.
So yeah, it's good. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, not really. I guess I would just, as I said, my big message now is trying to get guys to understand. I do podcasts like this unashamedly. I'm not hiding anything. This is marketing for me. You know?
Yeah.
I provide some degree of free information so that people will say, you know what? I realize that maybe I fucking need to fucking roll up my sleeves and learn a little more here. Do you know? My singularly greatest frustration is that I run a membership website that is designed to provide quality educational content to guys. And I charge a very modest fee. I charge $15 a month to access that. I think that's a very reasonable price, right? And yet people will often watch content like this and they go, oh, that was fabulous. And I will get emails and DMs and stuff from people going, oh, I love your content, Victor. I love your content. And I will encourage them to join the membership site. And it's crickets. Doing, God forbid I should spend fucking $15 fucking educating myself. Doing,
well, it's like the post that you put up that if you can afford to have these drugs, then I feel like you can afford to invest in some extra knowledge.
You could afford it. And the reason I'm so bullish about this is when I was learning, right, a long time ago now, dude, I bought every fucking book I could get my hands on. Like if it was a book, because it's pre-internet, you have to remember, right? If it was a book and it said steroids, I owned it. do you know what I'm saying? Like it's just I was so thirsty to learn that if I walked into a bookstore and there was a book on the thing that talked about the practical application of anabolic steroids and it was $30, that's coming home with me. Do you know what I mean? I was so willing to invest in my education that it was just, that's how it was. If there was a seminar 2 hours away from me and there's some guy speaking that was going to speak on the subject, I'd fucking get in my car and drive. And you want $50? I'm in the front seat. You know, I'm listening with my fucking ears open, right? We have become so fucking self-indulgent and self-entitled and self-lazy and expect everything to be free that doing these guys, like, you have to understand that the internet is both a blessing and a curse for educational purposes, right?
A lot of misinformation out there.
The amount of shit, I mean, I'm telling you, I watch people's content and I just sit there going, what the fuck are you talking about? You know what I mean? And the challenge is, if you don't know any better, it sounds really credible. Do you know what I mean? The guy has a following, the comments like generally positive feedback in the comments. You think this guy must know what he's talking about. But for people that have been doing this for a long time, you just sit there going, what the fuck are you? You're just dribbling shit, basically. You know? So my only request to guys would be this. If you seriously want to learn about this stuff, make an effort, right? I don't want to sound like the fucking back in my fucking day, you know, the fucking, I laughed at Broderick the other day because I'm thinking, holy crap, that's fucking me. But I mean, I seriously, if I was talking to a guy and he said there was a book about it, I would literally go out of my way and probably sometime later that day I owned that book because I wanted to learn and I was willing to spend a little bit of money. I mean, I had a limited budget. I was a young man with responsibilities and stuff like that, but willing to spend. The idea that there are now, you know, websites like my own, we talked about, you know, Broderick just before the call. Broderick Chavez was recently on the Fuad Abiyad podcast. I don't agree with everything Broderick says, but he's certainly a voice worth listening to. I certainly give him my little bit of money every, you know, month to hear what he has to say on something. I'll often watch things, you know, listen to him say things and say, look, I don't necessarily agree with that, but, you know, do no harm perspective. I think he's, you know, a credible voice in the community. Guys, spend a little money, support guys like Broderick, support guys like myself. If you see a book on steroids, buy the book. Don't expect everything to be free because you have to understand that, you know, people like myself who present this information, we present this as a marketing exercise to market our businesses, you know, and I would appreciate that anyone that watched this and went, well, that's really interesting. How do I learn more? Just understand I have a membership site with lots more. Doing, come to the site, pay your $15, you know, roll up your sleeves, dig in, start learning more.
Yeah, totally agree. I mean, it's definitely a teaser, and the man's a genius with some really interesting concepts. So, yeah. Do you want to say your website? Say the name.
It's been on the screen the whole time we're talking. So if you go to Instagram at Victor Black Masterclass, that's the same as the URL, victorblackmasterclass.com. So if you type in Victor Black Masterclass and into any search engine, I'm gonna ideally come up. I think I'm the only Victor Black.
You are.
I think I'm the only Victor Black Masterclass. So it should come up. And as I said, victorblackmasterclass.com is the membership website URL. So cool.
Wow.
Thank you, Tom.
So
I appreciate
the
the opportunity to come and talk to your new podcast. I look forward to seeing how things come out for you in the next couple of years. It's exciting, mate.